If you think of the word progressive, progressive means everything that's good, doesn't it, in our society? If you're progressive, then you're a good person. If you're not progressive, you're a really bad person. But, if you're in a doctor's surgery and he says to you, I'm afraid to say you have a progressive disease, progressive becomes a death sentence. So it's a question of what you're progressing to. And I think that's kind of what we've lost sight of. And I think tradition has a part to play in that.
What the data suggests is that there's a really strong return to religious faith, but it's not among these inclusive, liberal, secular, centrist, mainstream ones that will just let you be what it's among the either the more charismatic denominations or the more liturgically demanding ones. I really do think all is not lost. I'm genuinely
I think that.
Well, that's wonderful.
I'm a little ray of sunshine.
Yeah.
I didn't think I thought you might not quite appreciate that.
No, I appreciate it hugely. Hugely is wonderful, actually. Welcome to Socrates in the City. I'm Mary Harrington, writer and journalist, and I have the tremendous pleasure to be joined today by Melanie Phillips.
And hello, I'm Melanie Phillips. I'm a British journalist and author, and I have a new book, which I shall promptly plug, which was published in January in America by Wicked Sun, and it's called The Builder's Stone: How Jews and Christians Built the West and Why Only They Can Save It.
Today, we are inquiring together into the question of tradition. Tradition in a time of upheaval. Can the past ground the future? We have grappled for centuries now with the implications of modernity. In the 19th century, Karl Marx declared all that is solid melts into air in his critique and also embrace of technology and its transformative power. And his proposed solution is perhaps one which has yet to work, or perhaps yet to be properly tried. Later on, the jurist Carl Schmitt declared of the same technology that Karl Marx grappled with in the 19th century, that the machine has no tradition. So if we live in an age of machines, we live in an age of constantly advancing technology, we live in an age of never-ending demand for market growth. Is it really true that all that's solid must melt into air? Is it really true that a machine age can have no tradition? Or is there something that we can hold on to and reground ourselves in and retain, which is real and human and solid under these conditions? It's a big question. We've got 45 minutes.
It is a very big question, but in my view, they have to be melded together. Otherwise, we are toast. You can't have a machine without tradition, and you can't just have tradition without the machine, because we are the machine. We've created it. We are in a technological modern age. You can't disinvent these things, and on we go. We're going to continue to invent and so on. But I do think that what lies behind this sort of tangle we've got ourselves into is the fetishization of progress. So the idea is, I think, going back to Kant, maybe, that progress is inevitable and good. Well, it may be inevitable, but it's not necessarily an unalloyed good, because progress, I think, to create a good society, progress like freedom means progress towards what? Freedom in what cause? In other words, these things aren't ends in themselves. And the idea of progress means that if you fetishize it, as I think we've done, then it means that almost by definition you think that the past is somewhere where we don't need to go anymore. Tradition is something that holds us back. It is backward looking. We must always only go forward. The end of that is a kind of net zero approach, which means that you tear up the past and you say that everything that's new is good. Well, this idea of progress as being good is both good and bad. But if you think of the word progressive, progressive means everything that's good, doesn't it, in our society? If you're progressive, then you're a good person. If you're not progressive, you're a really bad person. But, if you're in a doctor's surgery and he says to you, I'm afraid to say you have a progressive disease, progressive becomes a death sentence. So it's a question of what you're progressing to. And I think that's kind of what we've lost sight of. And I think tradition has a part to play in that.
Absolutely, not least in helping us to elucidate where exactly these beliefs come from and how we've ended up with this curious conviction that progressive is somehow good by definition without really being able ever to define where it's going. I mean, this is really one of the inquiries that brought me to write Feminism Against Progress, which we published a couple of years ago, was really discovering in my late 20s that it was a realization I came to reluctantly, having internalized all of the usual ideas that you get from an average education in the 1990s, that progress is obviously good and, it means more freedom and more individualism and more stuff, by and large. And I got to the end of my 20s, and for various reasons, the global financial crash happened. My personal life fell apart for reasons too boring to explain now. In the midst of all of this, I sort of opened my eyes one day and realized I no longer believed in progress. I just didn't think it was a thing. And the book Feminism Against Progress came out of my seeking to understand if it's still possible to be a feminist if you don't believe in progress, because these two ideas are so closely bound up in one another. But in the course of that, I began to I realised that what we mean when we talk about progress is fundamentally a secularized version of the Christian eschaton. It's a secularized version of the Christian story, or the Christian account of history, which begins with creation and it ends in the day of judgment. But it's going from somewhere to somewhere, and then we end up somewhere which is everyone assumes better. We end up in the kingdom of God. That's the very, very long arc of Christian history into the future, including its prophetic element. And the idea of progress is really that inextricable from that linear and moralized idea of history. It's just sanded away the religious component and made it a purely secularized, purely materialized, purely something which happens in this world. So much closer to what Eric Vogelin was talking about when he warned about immanentizing the eschaton, trying to realize heaven on earth. And I mean, I referenced Karl Marx at the beginning of this, and I mean, communism is actually one of the ideologies that Vogelin talks about as an instance of people trying to immanentize the eschaton, trying to realize heaven on earth. In a purely materialistic sense. But there are others, and I think I've come gradually to the view that the version of secular liberal materialism which travels under the banner of progress in that moralized sense that you so neatly characterized is the version which survived out of the wars of the ideological wars of the early 20th century, and having dispatched having dispatched National Socialism as unacceptable, and having dispatched communism kind of as unacceptable, the same attempt to immanentize the eschaton is somehow still with us.
Yes, very much so.
And is somehow something that we're still trying to do. And it expresses itself again and again in that belief that whatever it is that's in the past is bad by definition. C.S. Lewis, I think, called that chronological snobbery, which is a great term for it. And this idea you can just look down on whatever has been and not and just dismiss it as by definition worse than whatever is.
Yes.
Was it what has unburdened? It was the Kamala Harris line. What will be unburdened by what has been?
That sounds a bit sort of too logical and words in the right order for Kamala Harris.
She said it a great many times. So much so that it sort of became a running joke. But yeah, whatever it will be better by definition if it's unburdened by what has been. And really the question I think that all of us are confronting now is, really? Are you sure? And is it actually possible to slough off absolutely everything about who and what we are? And I believe it's becoming increasingly obvious that the answer to that is no. And really the feminist, I mean, I use the term in a more expansive sense, I think, than is usually the case. The feminist case I make against progress rests very simply on the idea that it's not in women's interests to pretend that we can abandon the givens of our bodies, and that fundamentally that will work against the interests of women and against the interests of children and against our ability to live together as two sexes and as families.
Indeed. I mean, it's not an original saying, but I do believe it to be absolutely true that people who deny the past will not have a future, because if you de-anchor yourself from the past. You de-anchor yourself from everything that gives you a kind of national, social, political, moral identity. You destroy the scaffolding which holds up your culture. You destroy the culture. Now, we've told ourselves collectively over, well, I mean, how far back does one go? One can go back a very, very long way. But basically, over time, and increasingly, we've told ourselves that God is dead, and that the only thing that matters is the individual. And what matters is that the individual must realize their own path to happiness and fulfillment and so on. So the idea that, God is dead goes along with the idea that religion is first of all absurd, that only stupid people have a religious belief, and secondly, religion stands for all bad things, and consequently it must be replaced. Biblical morality, biblical values must be replaced by universal values, which are kind of universal because, well, they're kind of imprinted in our DNA. We don't need to be religious to have these principles. We all know what they are because, we're born with them and they're universal. Well, they're not universal because most cultures don't have them. I mean, what are we talking about? We're talking about fundamental, what I would call not just the values of Western civilization, but civilized values, which the West gave to the world. And what are they? Well, we can all think of the ones that are particular to our way of life. But I would say respect for every human life, care and compassion for other people, desire to put others' interests above your own, belief in justice, the idea of right and wrong, the idea of truth as opposed to lies, standing up for what is right against people who abuse power, and all that kind of thing. Rule of law being, governing everybody according to one rule of law. Now, these things didn't come from nowhere. They came from a very particular set of traditions. Now, people say, well, it was all the Greeks that gave us all the good stuff and religion gave us all the bad stuff. Well, that's simply not true. The ancient Greeks gave us a lot in the West. That's true. And religious believers drew upon the Greeks. But nevertheless, what I would say would be the core civilized values, in my view, came from biblical values. They came from Christianity, which is the foundational creed of the West. And Christianity didn't come from nowhere. It came from Judaism. These are basically beliefs that came from Judaism and the ancient kingdom of Israel. Now, if you say that religion is bunk and we're not going to have anything to do with that, which is what we've said, and instead we must have universal values. So then you invent these universal values and you give them binding authority through international and transnational institutions, such as the United Nations, the international courts of criminal court, court of justice, and so on, the great NGOs, Amnesty, and Save the Children, Oxfam, and so on. And these are what now passes for conscience. And I think that's deeply problematic for various reasons. But the thing that strikes me, and it struck me from what you were saying, was this, that, okay, the West got rid of religion because God is stupid, God is dead. We now have universal values, which are completely nothing to do with religion. And we've thus replaced what I would call truth by power. We've replaced belief in God by a variety of secular ideologies, which is ideas which we tell ourselves are universal ideas and therefore sanctified and good. What am I talking about? I'm talking about moral relativism, the idea that what I think is right, the idea of cultural relativism. I cannot assert that the West is better than any other culture. On the contrary, the West is worse than other cultures because it was born in colonialism and racism and so on. Materialism, all sorts of isms are the ideologies of today. Now, if you look at those ideologies, virtually everyone has a Christian template. The idea of sin, penance, and redemption. I mean, look at multiculturalism. Multiculturalism, the original sin of racism, colonialism, whiteness, blah, blah, blah. We have to do penance. We have to tell ourselves and tell everybody about the sin of our own whiteness. And then we redeem ourselves by abolishing ourselves and embracing multiculturalism.
And the tragedy of seeking to do this entirely on the immanent plane, the here and now, is that if you try and do the Christian narrative, but without any possibility of an arc of redemption and any element that takes place prophetically in the future or in the kingdom of God, it's not possible to complete the arc. All you're stuck with is the sin and the penance, and there's no exit. It becomes a kind of hell.
And absolutely, it becomes a kind of hell, and it's a hell that is policed, because
you're not allowed to leave.
Just as in ancient medieval Christianity, which had inquisitions and persecuted dissenters and had, witchcraft trials, we have exactly that going on in our universities, which are supposed to be the crucible of reason, and actually are kind of secularized medieval witchcraft, witch hunting centres, which is extraordinary and remarkable to me and deeply terrible, because what biblical values gave us was the really good things. And consequently, by eviscerating the really good things of to mix my metaphor terribly, the moral scaffolding that holds them up, we've kind of gone down the rabbit hole, gone through the looking glass and reversed everything. So if there's no such thing as truth, there's no such thing as lies. So we believe lies. And if I tell you that the facts mean that what you have just said is a lie, well, I can't bring facts to the table because there are no facts. Everything is matter of opinion. It's only my opinion. And you can tell me that that my opinion is worthless because you can tell me I'm a partisan. You don't like my opinion. So you win if you are stronger than me. That's where we've got to. It's a kind of, take in Hobbes. It's the war of all against all. It's what we're in.
On a slightly more positive note, because I really do think all is not lost. I'm genuinely very well. That's wonderful.
I'm a little ray of sunshine.
Yeah.
I didn't think I thought you might not quite appreciate that.
No, I appreciate it hugely. Is it wonderful, actually? The biggest point of optimism for me, I think, one was something which I think is very striking and really an extraordinary moment, actually. I'll tell you the moment where this really hit me, confronted me, I'm sure you remember the New Atheism, which was perhaps the nadir of aggressively militant secularism as a kind
Indeed.
of confrontational force in the early 2000s. And it really had sort of political potency and cultural potency at the time.
Very
it
much
just
so.
felt, we both remember that vividly. And there was a really extraordinary moment yesterday. I was in New York at a Festival of Ideas a year ago, and on stage were Richard Dawkins and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, both of whom were, in the noughties, luminaries of the New Atheism.
Indeed.
And they were discussing Ayaan's conversion to Christianity. And she described the Damascene moment that had brought her to that and how transformative it had been. And there was a kind of bewilderment, an honest bewilderment, almost a distress in Richard's response. And I watched this dialogue and I think, 20 years ago, this simply could not have happened, let alone on a stage in front of hundreds of people, all of whom had spent $300 on a ticket in New York in peak Festival of Ideas season. This wouldn't be happening.
Yeah.
And yet here we are.
Yeah.
This is an extraordinary cultural moment and a real turn. And it's not just Ayaan. There are Justin Brierley's book on the surprising rebirth of belief in God documents a number of thinkers who've returned to a respectful engagement with religious ideas, even if they remain sort of strategically ambiguous themselves on the subject. And there are others who really have just embraced a return to religious faith.
Yes, and we see this among young people.
And what's especially fascinating about it, really to sort of loop us back into this theme of tradition anchoring this very chaotic world we find ourselves in, is that what the data suggests in the UK at least, and I believe in the United States as well, is that there's a really strong return to religious faith, but it's not it's not among these inclusive, liberal, secular, centrist, mainstream ones that will just let you be what it's among either the more charismatic denominations or the more liturgically demanding ones. So the Roman Catholics are flourishing. Greek Orthodoxy is astonishingly flourishing. I mean, ortho-bros, they call them in the United States. There's a whole sort of subculture of a very, 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 very young, very earnest embrace of Greek Orthodoxy, which I think is really the most sort of liturgically obdurate of all of the Christian confessions. But I think there's particularly the fact that what people are looking for is not a faith where you get to turn up at Christmas and Easter and everybody just lets you do what you want. What people want it to mean more than that. It's either got to make you feel something, or it's got to ask something of you, preferably both. Or it's pointless.
Yes, I think what people are looking for, obviously, is structure and order. I think this is the point that having got rid of God as a society, broadly speaking, on the basis that this is the route to happiness and fulfillment and freedom, we have found collectively we've been sold a pup. It doesn't produce that at all. We have record numbers of people, especially young people, who are suffering from a variety of psychological disorders. And without wishing for a moment to denigrate or deny the kind of clinical particularities of particular psychological ailments, it seems to me that so many of them are to do with a sense of rootlessness and purposelessness and despair. I mean, if you are brought up to believe, as so many are, that we are basically a sack of atoms whirling pointlessly through the universe, we come from nowhere, we're going nowhere. And if you are also brought up to believe, as we've educated our children over now several generations to understand, that it's a kind of onslaught on their autonomy to put any obstacles in their path. Everybody's entitled to achieve everything that everybody else has. And insofar as they're not entitled, those are obstacles that are illegitimately placed in front of them. All problems must be swept away. Now, I'm certainly not saying that people should have problems, people should have distress, people should have crises in their lives. I mean, that's horrible. But nevertheless, unless you have challenges to yourself, then you don't really have a sense of purpose. The more you have a structure that holds you, the more freedom you have. It's one of these great paradoxes. Without the structure, you're a kind of lost soul. And it seems to me that so much of the distress that we see in psychological terms coming out, and also the distress in acting out the distress in terms of crime, in terms of drug use, alcohol use, all kinds of self-abuse. And then you look also at the way in which the traditional family has broken down. Again, that was willed on the basis that the traditional family was an oppressive institution which destroyed particularly women's ability to realize themselves. And as a result of which, long story short, we have exponential numbers of children who are not only fatherless, not only don't even know who their father ever was, but come from totally disruptive and disrupted backgrounds which don't nurture them. And so the result of all this is we have untold numbers of lost souls who are crying out for meaning and purpose in their lives. Now, once upon a time, that was given by religion. We threw over religion collectively on the basis this was oppressive and an obstacle and so on. And now, lo and behold, increasing numbers of people, especially young people, are kind of inching their way, or more than inching, sometimes galloping towards this. But as you say, not in the sense of, it's a once a week encounter in a church or on Good Friday or on Christmas. It has to be something much deeper and much more spiritually fulfilling. But everywhere you look, people are looking for meaning. I mean, in this godless society, one of the fastest growing things is witchcraft. I mean, this is like completely crazy. And you look at people, going through these attempts at giving themselves meaning. So classically, they will turn in recent years to religions of the East. They think that is the right sort of meaning, because religions of the East they think are kind of spiritual without any of the stuff that gets in the way of having a good time. And people in the East seem to be so peaceful and so spiritual, unlike rapacious capitalist West. I mean, have they seen Eastern societies and how cruel and barbaric they are? I mean, this is crazy. So, but everywhere you look, people are finding ways of giving themselves meaning in meaningless ways. So, if you're going to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast, as people who believe in astrology do, people who believe in Wiccanism do, why not believe in 6 impossible things before breakfast that have actually created a great civilization called the West and have actually produced the best template for individual flourishing ever known to mankind?
There's a lot to be said for that. I was speaking to a Roman Catholic priest the other day who told me he has a lot of young people who come to him and at his diocese. They show up out of nowhere. And he said that consistently the story is, I just feel broken. I've done all the things they told me it would be fine to do, and I just feel broken. Help me.
Right.
And that's the mood. And these are kids, they've gone and they've done the loveless dating merry-go-round, and they've done the try and scrape a living, and they've done life on the template which is supposed to be the good and liberating one, and they end up at a Roman Catholic church just with that very basic, please help me. And
yet our political and cultural elites aren't at this point at all.
They are not. If this is a very qualified kind of optimism, but my sense is we're at a moment of learning the hard way. There's a sense that it's a pattern that keeps coming back again. It's a theme that runs through so many of the upheavals and the reversals that it seems to me we're going through at the moment. So, for example, a swathe of young people finding their way back to sometimes liturgically demanding faiths, but also where we are at grappling with this idea that anybody can be whatever sex they want to be, for example.
Right.
Which actually, really, to pick up on your point about parenting, one of the things which is fascinating about transgender identity and this sort of explosion of desire to be a special gender amongst young people is that in my observation and in my researches on the subject, there seem to be 2 characteristic family patterns to where these kids come from. They're either from very broken and disrupted families, or they're from really quite well off upper middle class ones. And I've been sort of scratching my head about this and
what's the common denominator?
What's the common denominator? And I mean, this is not something I can prove. I don't have the data to prove this, although it ought to be empirically researchable. But one of my hypotheses about that is that somewhere in the mix, in all the sort of sociocultural influences which have combined to create that, which is the internet and the contemporary culture, and a bunch of other things that you and I have both written about, I believe, quite a bit. One of the factors, I think, is inadequate care as an infant. This is not something it ought to be empirically researchable, but there's pretty robust evidence, from years of very meticulous study of early infant development, that particularly at the very the preverbal stage, not to 15 months, I suppose, but especially 0 to 12, there are types of relationship formation for a baby which are critical to self-regulation, really the fundamentals of your personality, being able to hold yourself together in an emotionally difficult situation.
Exactly.
Being able to trust that the world will still be there when you open your eyes again. Really quite basic stuff, which we take for granted as functioning adults.
Yes.
But which actually not everyone can take for granted, because if that stuff is disturbed or doesn't develop properly, then you get people who have psychological meltdowns in the middle of a university campus, for example.
Exactly.
Or you have people who are not sufficiently formed in their sense of having a self at all, such that they demand that the state create, regulate, and enforce one for them. I mean, this is hypothetical on my part, but to me, it stacks.
It's
it
obvious.
Stacks. Like that somewhere in the mix, I would be very surprised if there isn't at least some correlation between those young people who end up struggling with gender confused and some experience of interrupted or challenging childcare situation. And I can also see why that would map onto the very upper class and the most dysfunctional end of the poor. I'm sure you can see the logic of that.
Absolutely, I entirely agree with you. The family, it's been often said, is the kind of sort of a society in miniature. When it's working well, it teaches you everything you need to know about being a functioning human being in a civilized society. It teaches you love, proper love. In other words, putting other people before yourself. Bonds of unbreakable trust and commitment, loyalty, duty, and all kinds of stuff which socializes you in a broad sense. If that pattern is disrupted, then all that stuff is bust. And more fundamentally, as you've just said, it just plays havoc with the child's sense of identity. The child's sense of identity is anchored in being brought up by the people who made me. Now, sometimes that is not possible, and we should always be very solicitous when that happens. But when that pattern of mother, father, and child is broken. But what happened decades ago, and I followed this closely at the time, was that it was broken deliberately on the basis that it was oppressive to women, and that women could and should do this all themselves. And consequently, you have these huge exponential rises in lost children who are not being cared for properly in the way that makes them have a good sense of identity. And you say, you don't think that there is evidence that can support this empirically.
There's a lot of circumstantial evidence, but nobody's done the studies because, of course, they haven't.
Well, this is the point. So forgive me for being ultra cynical, but I no longer believe a word that social scientists say. And I know there are social scientists who are full of integrity and produce good stuff. So I apologize to all those people.
But you really do have to read the rest sideways.
Decades ago, I observed that certain truths could not be entertained in the academy, in social science, if those truths pointed to the evidence that, by and large, relatively speaking, generalizing, it was better for children to be brought up by their married mother and father.
There is one very helpful study. There's one really helpful study, which was, I think, more recently than back then. I think you're absolutely right that there are certain truths, certain irreducible facts about family life.
I watched academics hounded out of the academy.
It's absolutely correct. And anyone with eyes and a functioning brain can see it. As a mother, I observe my daughter's classmates. If you have eyes and a functioning brain, you can see it. Where the challenges are more likely to be and where they aren't. You can see it. There was one very interesting and very instructive study that came out, I think, more recently. Canada, one of the states in Canada, experimented with offering universal free childcare from birth.
Oh yeah.
Available to anybody who wanted it. And they discovered fairly quickly, not only did a lot of families not want it, but the outcomes were worse, objectively, unavoidably worse for those children which took up universal childcare from birth. I mean, this ought to be intuitively obvious. You think about the work that the child psychiatrist Donald Winnicott was doing. 50, 70, 80 years. When was he writing? In the 50s, I think, the 50s and 60s. And he was writing about the contribution to really, he's talking about tiny babies and how holding, handling and object presentation, is crucial to the development of sort of fundamental components of somebody's functioning character.
That's right.
The way they're held by the person who looks after them all day, the way they're handled, all of that serves to build a particular kind of relationship with the world. It begins with whoever it is caring for you every day, but eventually that becomes your template for how you relate to the world. And you can see how that would just be qualitatively different in a way which is unchangeable between a child who's been tended to lovingly by the same person day in, day out in an intimate, trusting setting, affectionate setting, and one in which perhaps they have 4 or 5 different caregivers, and they're sort of, and there are other babies competing for attention, and everybody might be genuinely, sincerely doing their best, and yet it's just not the same.
Exactly. Well, and indeed, but what people like you and me have to confront and contend with and face up to is the collision, and it is a collision, between what you and I have just been saying and the fact that there are large numbers of people who cannot live like that, or who choose not to live like that. One of the reasons why these academics became, I think, they betrayed their own calling in social science, and I had dealings with a few of them. They were very distinguished, and they suddenly changed from saying all this, that basically, mother and father, child, that's the best template, to saying the opposite, saying it doesn't matter. And I said to them, why have you changed? And they said things like, look, I have children and grandchildren now, and they're not living like that, and I can no longer write this. Or they said, we cannot stand in the way of cultural change. These are seismic cultural changes in which people are no longer living in this traditional way. They're living a variety of different lifestyles. We cannot be Canute. And then,
but what you'll see, actually, again, more recently, that it's very often the case that the people who parrot these opinions will themselves lead very much more conservative lives than that. I mean, this is what Rob Henderson calls luxury beliefs. These are high status opinions which it makes you look and perhaps feel good to express, but which you may not follow through in your own life.
Yes.
I mean, it's fairly consistently, it's much more consistently the case that those liberals most committed to propagating these ideas will themselves be more likely to stay married, and they'll be more likely to get married before they have children, and they'll and they'll be more likely to prioritize a functioning family life, even if they're hand waving the fact that it doesn't matter for everybody else. You watch what they do rather than what they say.
But by definition, but given what we've been saying, there's vast numbers who don't live like that, and whose children just fall by the wayside, and and one has to have, I'm thinking of gay people in particular, who used to berate me for saying, well, even if I agreed with everything you're saying, and of course I don't, but even if I did, where does that leave me? And to which, it's a very hard doctrine that I'm advocating. And I would not wish to stop anybody from living in the way that they wanted to. But what has worried me all these decades is not that individuals choose to live as they wish to, and I would not wish them to be pilloried or discriminated against. I would wish them to be treated with equal respect. But the problem that I perceived to be developing, and has now become the kind of accepted situation, was that the very idea of normative living didn't just disintegrate, it was destroyed deliberately
I wrote an essay on this. I titled Normophobia.
Right, on the basis that to be normative, to say that you should have social or moral or cultural norms, was in itself discriminatory, because by definition, and this is true, people who choose not to live by those norms are not normative, they're not normal. And so I was being accused of saying effectively, you're saying to me I'm not normal. I mean, so when it's brought down to the particular, to the individual who says, I might agree with you, but where does it leave me? How can I have a happy life? How can I have a fulfilled life? I can't answer that on a personal level.
It ought to be possible, you would think, to acknowledge that some people are outliers to the norm, and also to acknowledge that there are such things as norms. That's how
I would wish to be. So I have said to these people collectively over time, I absolutely sympathise with where you're coming from. Really, I do. It's genuine. However, you are sawing off the branch on which you are sitting. Because if you think that the kind of society that you are now not just endorsing, but bringing about, if you think that that society is going to uphold the values that you depend on, of freedom, of compassion, of a cohesive society in which people look after each other, you are very mistaken, because it's not going to be like that. You are going to be the victims of what's coming, and your children are going to be the victims of what's coming.
What I find so fascinating about this, that we can characterise as normophobia, is that in a sense it's the ideology of the machine. It's the ideology of applying technology to liberate ourselves from every possible given, because that's really what underwrites it. You look again and again and again at what allows us, in theory at least, to escape, the normative patterns of human reproduction, for example, or to escape the normative limits on material abundance, for example. Everywhere you look, again and again, it's some technological innovation or other, or a whole plethora of technological innovations that underwrites that and allows us to claim.
Pill.
The contraceptive pill actually is a paradigmatic example. Now, I've framed that as our entry into the transhumanist era, because that's the point at which we began to apply this ideology of the machine to ourselves, and to act as if it were possible to escape even the givens of our own embodied existence as men and women, as humans who need to reproduce, etc., and so on. And and then this has gone into even wilder territory the further it goes on. So what begins as women using synthetic hormones to escape to have sex without pregnancy, becomes men claiming the right to take the same synthetic hormones so they can present themselves as women, and that then becomes people using further technologies to escape the givens of how human reproduction as such works, and then from that you have more contemporary startups where people are saying, no, actually we can just edit the human genome, and we can optimize babies for intelligence, or I don't know, perhaps we could engineer entirely new. And so what begins with the applying technology to wage war on human nature, really to wage war on the human form. The normative human physiological form becomes in theory a limitless opportunity for technological innovation and all of it is encapsulated in this ideological war on normativity as such. But what I think is so fascinating, just to complete that thought, is the way it doesn't seem to matter how hard people wage war on these norms, these really fundamental givens of human existence. They just keep coming back. There's that quote from Horace, you can drive nature out with a pitchfork and still she comes back. We've spent, it's half a century since the contraceptive pill. And the early utopians, they all thought that it would do away with sexist double standards. They thought it would do away with, and everybody would just be able to be the same, and we'd all live in this sort of polymorphously perverse kind of sex utopia. Didn't happen. Either young people are just not having very much sex at all, or the differences between the sexes in terms of their desires and yearnings in mate formation is more extreme than ever. You have these dating apps which are optimized for a certain kind of promiscuous male sexuality, and which is just disastrous for both sexes, because it's sort of optimizing the same things and has kind of turned human intimacy into a commodity. And in all of that, the fact that we're men and we're women hasn't gone away. People, and if anything, today, young people now, I think, are more cognizant and more attuned to, and less utopian about the irreducible nature of sex dimorphism than they were 10 years ago, let alone 25. When I think back to the boomer generation, a lot of the boomers really were utopian because they could imagine a future in which sex dimorphism had been done away with.
Yeah, it's my generation that's all at fault. It's true.
Hashtag not all boomers. Very clearly not all boomers, but some of them certainly. And yet 50 years in, it hasn't worked. And I speak to a great many young people now who can just see it. They've stopped pretending that it can be abolished. There's there are dissenting factions there, but there are a growing number of young people who are like, no, obviously this is a thing, and we've done our best to technologize it away, and it's just not going away.
Yeah.
And just returning to our theme of technology and upheaval, and tradition, it seems to me that we will not cease from exploration, as Eliot said, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started. and know the place for the first time. And that's what's happening with young people after half a century of experimentation in sex dimorphism.
He also said that liberalism will ultimately destroy itself. Because
I think he was absolutely right.
So you can't have both. You can't have both. Either we're going to come back to where we started, which is probably good, or we're going to destroy ourselves. Which is it?
I don't know. Well, okay. I think the way I would square that circle is to say we can destroy modernity without destroying humans.
I hope so.
And I think that's...
When I say I hope so, I'm sure that's true. Of course that's true. And in fact, it must be true, because if we're going the way we are dehumanizing all the time. When you talk about the machine and the onslaught on the normative, the ultimate point of that is dehumanization. We cannot afford to go there without literally extinguishing ourselves. Yeah. But the question is, can we get back to that? I mean, all these young people, this is a great source of hope, that all these young people are gravitating back to something approaching what I would call sanity. But at the same time, the levers of the culture are not being pulled in that direction. And the kind of moral leaders of the culture are not giving a kind of roadmap for all these young people. Where do they go with this? They've all understood, okay, these people have all understood that this is a dead end, that we've gone down the rabbit hole, that we're in a trap, that it's done terrible damage to me and so on and so forth. Okay, great. That's fantastic. That's really a source of optimism. But that has to be harnessed somehow by somebody, and that is called, moral, spiritual and cultural leadership. Where is it? It ain't there at the moment.
It's not there yet. I mean, here's a bleaker scenario for how we end up back where we started and know the place for the first time. I forget who did the research, but there's fairly robust evidence that shows who's having kids. There's talk everywhere now about the fertility crisis, so-called. I'm not so sure it's a crisis. It seems, in the sense that it seems to me like a rational collective response to an intolerable situation.
Well, it may be rational, but it's not a crisis.
For modernity, it's a crisis. But so who's having kids? The people who are having kids tend to be they tend to be people who don't use very much technology, and they tend to be people with strong religious faith. Mm-hmm. Those people are still having kids. Mm-hmm. Everybody else is in the process of deleting themselves from the gene pool. Yes. I mean, this is a dark way of putting it, and I don't actually think any of this is funny. But this is in
social
fact
Darwinism in reverse.
Well, precisely. And what that looks like, if you run that scenario over 2 or 3 generations, what you end up with is effectively the human species is still there. Human species is alive and well and absolutely fine. But what has deleted itself is modern high-tech society, simply because it just refused to have kids.
Well, I think that's one way of looking at it. But
what you end up with again is communities of the low-tech and the very religious.
But there's another way of looking at it, which is to say that every country, every nation is failing in the West is failing to reproduce itself.
That's absolutely right.
And consequently, it's going to be replaced by something else. Now, I mean, in my view, what's going to replace it, if it doesn't stop doing this, is the culture that understands what's going on better than the West understands what's going on, which is predatory Islamism, and it's moving in. And that's what we're going to see, and that's the great struggle that's already happening. It's about to happen. Now, if I can bang the drum for the place where I spend most of my time now, which is the state of Israel. Israel is the one Western country which bucks the trend. In Israel, there are approximately between 3 and 4 babies per woman being born. This has nothing to do with people being ultra-religious. This is to do with with Israelis wanting their culture and their country, their nation and their culture that it represents to continue. They are a people who are galvanized by the will to live, are based on hope in the future. Now, this is what the West has lost collectively, the sense that it is worth surviving, that there is something to live for, and that it is a hopeful thing to live for, because what you should live for to perpetuate your society is something that you should absolutely invest in, and you should want children to continue that because you think it's great. It is something which enables you as a person to flourish. It enables your society to flourish. It enables civilized values to flourish. You believe in it. You love it. And you love the traditions that have made it. You understand that to keep it going, you have to keep those traditions alive. In other words, you have to educate by transmitting the culture down through the generations. These are things which have not just been lost, they've been deliberately destroyed. Now that's where the West has got to come back to in order to perpetuate itself. Otherwise, it's finished as a culture. That's what worries me, that there is no leadership currently which perceives this. So on the one hand, you have this, in my view, fantastically optimism creating situation in which, as you describe, loads of young people are getting it on that level, and also on political level, the rise of populism in Britain and Europe. Now, you may hate Reform and Nigel Farage. You may well think that a number of these populist parties and individuals in Europe are actually very dangerous. They are authoritarian. Okay, fine. That's not the point. The point I'm making is that there are millions and millions of people who get it, who want their culture to continue, who understand that what's at stake is Western civilization, Western culture, their Western nation state, which embodies all those values. They love them, they admire them, they want them to continue. And that's a great source of hope too. So this is what I rely on, all these millions of people who really do get it at various levels of this conversation that we're having. The difficulty that we're all up against is that there is no leadership at the moment which is brave enough or insightful enough or connected enough or educated enough to get it and to say, okay, guys, we've gone wrong. This is how we're going to go forward. And we're not going to go back to an age where people really were persecuted for not being normative. We're not going to go back to that. But we are no longer going to go down the road of saying there are no norms. Because if we don't have norms, then we don't have a society. And if we don't have norms based on our particular culture and traditions, then we no longer have this particular society, which is the best society.
On that too, I'm not without hope. I've had some conversations
recently.
Gosh, you
are an optimist.
I really am. I mean, these are strange and chaotic times.
They are indeed.
Nobody would disagree with that. But I'm not without hope. Even in Britain, where things really do feel very bleak at the moment, I'm not without hope.
Politically,
even.
Okay, explain.
No, this is based on conversations which I can't really relay publicly. But I am
Give
not
us
without
the general
hope.
gist.
There are. It's not just the angry working class Brits who've noticed.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, it's Peter Turchin who writes about elite overproduction and how revolutions never happen from the bottom. They just don't. Revolutions always require a dissident counter elite.
Right. Exactly.
I have some. I'm not without hope on that front. I'll just leave it there.
Interesting.
I think it's not beyond the realm of possibility in the United Kingdom as well. And I feel genuinely very positive about that. It's going to be a bumpy ride, and I do think it's possible that where we end up at the end of that bumpy ride is with a version of Western civilization which has retrieved more of what that meant prior to modernity, which is to say prior to all of the technological and consciousness changes that came downstream of the printing press and the Reformation, which is really it's the sort of enabling frame of modernity as such. From that you get nation states, and you get the Industrial Revolution, and you get the Age of Empires, and you get all of that that marvelous stuff. And I think sometimes I really believe it's an error, and one that very, very clearly you're not prone to, but some are prone to. When they sort of wave vaguely at Western civilization, they're just pointing to modernity. And sort of vaguely including America, and actually really mostly they just mean the American Empire, as it currently is, with a few sort of nice statues when you go on holiday to Europe. And I don't know, like there's a lot more to it. There was a solid 1,500 years of Christendom, prior to that, and that probably all counts as well. And there's an immense wealth of wisdom, of philosophy, of art, of religious practice, of theology, and the incredible riches of the Middle Ages, I feel, have become relevant again and are still largely underexplored in the context of salvaging who and what we are, and in its deepest roots.
I have to say, as a Jewish person, the idea of going back to the Middle Ages does not fill me with a great deal of enthusiasm.
I can absolutely respect that. I mean, I certainly wasn't suggesting in that respect.
I know you weren't.
There are troubling implications in terms of solidarity between Christendom and Judaism, where you start talking about the reemergence of religious faith that has real teeth. Because yes, history tells the stories it tells, and they're not always happy ones in that respect. That's absolutely right. And yet, to discard Thomas Aquinas on that basis would be a mistake, I think. Thomas Aquinas as far as I know, he never had anything to say on that particular political question. But to discard all of scholastic theology on the basis that
one should never discard. One should never discard. On the other hand, one should not necessarily return to embracing what should not be embraced. I mean, it seems to me.
Have I managed to persuade Melanie Phillips to argue against tradition?
Well, I would certainly argue against a return to medieval inquisitions.
So perhaps we've arrived at a sort of magnificently centrist position in the end. We can say we need to anchor ourselves in tradition, and we need critically to read our traditions in the light of who and what we are now. That feels like a sort of respectably centrist and respectfully traditionalist stance, perhaps?
Well, we should certainly go back to the elements of our traditional and cultural heritage from which we derive our core values. We have to establish what those core values are, obviously. And that's not an easy task in itself. It's all disputable. But nevertheless, to say that we can have those values without going back to those traditions, I think is wrong. And those traditions are anchored in, I would say, the Hebrew Bible, mediated by Christianity, which is, not unproblematic in various ways. And that doesn't mean that everyone's got to become a religious believer in either Judaism or Christianity. But it does mean that you've got to understand that those are principles which we've not just taken God out of them, we've actually undone them. So, for example, we live in a culture which tells itself that human rights is the ultimate good, that everything is, that human rights defines conscience. Well, actually, human rights obviates conscience, because human rights, disanchored from responsibility, is basically just a set of demands that people make. And who do they make it of? Well, if you don't have a prior structure of duty and responsibility, well, who do you claim your rights from? Well, there isn't anybody, there isn't anything, and consequently, well, the nearest thing we have to God is the state. So you go down that particular rabbit hole. So in my view, you have to get back to a society, create a society that's based on the values of duty and responsibility, which in my view create a society, create a community. That's rooted in the Bible. It's to do with personal responsibility. That's rooted in the Bible. It's to do with respect for every human being on the basis that they're made in the image of God. If you take out God, you have no more respect for every human being. You don't have to be a religious person to understand that, we have got rid of all that by creating human rights as the shrine before which we worship. Consequently, you have to undo all that. You have to undo the human rights culture and get back to a culture based on duty and responsibility. You don't have to be a religious person to do that. You just have to understand that without that, the society goes smash. So that's where I'm kind of coming from. Is that going back to the old? Not necessarily. Because you can't sort of go back to what was before. But you can extricate from what was before what is important to you now, and what is crucial in giving you a future. Again, that's not a situation that can be done without argument, but nevertheless, I think that's the way we have to go.
Yeah, I think what will be very interesting is as we grapple collectively, and really across the West with these questions, we'll be discovering whether or not we really can get there without once again becoming religious people. And to me, I think that really is an open question. You know, can we do it on fumes? Can we do it on a strongly religious minority and everybody else going along with it? Can we do it as secular people, just with a respectful engagement with religious tradition? I don't know. I suspect that strong faith is on its way back, and I have very mixed feelings about that. But I suspect that that's how we will get there, back to this culture of duty and responsibility, and that I think it will be a bumpy ride getting there. Nonetheless, it's very clear. You know, I think both of us very much agree that we can't go on as we are, and I have a great deal of hope for the future. It seems clear to me that this is perhaps the end of modernity, or one iteration of modernity, but it's not the end of us, and it's certainly and it need not be a civilizational end. So I think that's that's where I've got to. It needn't be any kind of a civilizational end.
I think the jury is very much out, personally. I think there are certainly grounds for hope. I'm not persuaded that the West actually wants to save itself. I think that many people do. I'm not persuaded that there is yet a critical mass, and I'm not sure that there's enough time to get that critical mass. But if the West wants to save itself, I think it could, but it needs, shoulders to the wheel. I think, as I say, it's not clear whether a civilization like the West, just like the Roman Empire, just 1 minute it thinks it's invincible, and the next minute it's gone. Civilizations do crumble like that, and it's possible that might happen to the West. Again, I'm looking at it from the perspective of a Jewish person born and bred in Britain, now spending most of my time in Israel, looking at Britain in horror, at the fact that it seems to be morally having eviscerated itself of conscience and justice and even rationality.
Certainly, the current government doesn't afford much scope for hope.
So
but I speak to people who are not in government and who have a stronger vision of where we might of other ways that the country might be. It's
they're there. Those people are there.
All is not lost. Well, let's hope, Melanie, that your new book has something to.
It does.
To prick the sides of everybody's intent and to galvanise some enthusiasm for salvaging.
Well, it certainly expresses the hope and belief that that the Western civilization is a show that can and must be kept on the road, and provide some ways of in which I think it can actually do that. So from that point of view, it is a hopeful book.
Amen to that.
So I think we can both hope that our mutual optimism will be realised in the near future.
Let's hope. Perhaps on that surprisingly optimistic note, for two fairly polemical writers, we should say here's hoping.
Absolutely, here's to that.
Here's to that. And what a pleasure it's been to have this conversation with you, and what a privilege.
It's been absolutely my privilege, and I've learned a lot, as I do from everything that you write, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you think these conversations are valuable, would you do us a favor and please like this video and subscribe to this channel? When you do that, you help us get these conversations out to a wider audience by telling YouTube that people are interested in this. Also, you can go to SocratesInTheCity.com, sign up for our newsletter, and you can check back every week. There's new stuff here every week. Thank you for tuning in.